My daughter showed me her real birth certificate and asked, "Why does it say I was born 3 years before you adopted me?" The words hit me like a freight train. Mia was 16, and I'd told her we adopted her as a newborn, but the document in her hands showed she was born 3 years before the date I'd always celebrated as her gotcha day. My mouth went dry as I stared at the official paperwork. Mia had found it while looking for her passport in my desk drawer for a school trip. The birth certificate clearly showed her birth date as March 15th, 2005, but I'd been telling her she was adopted in 2005. The math didn't add up, and my teenage daughter was smart enough to notice. I sat down heavily on the couch, trying to figure out how to explain something I'd hoped she'd never have to know. "Sweetheart, there are some parts of your adoption story that are more complicated than I told you when you were little." But Mia wasn't buying vague explanations anymore. She sat across from me with the determination of a teenager who'd caught her parent in a lie. "Mom, this says I was 3 years old when you adopted me. That means I have memories from before. Why don't I remember anything? And why have you been lying about this my entire life?" The truth was devastating, and I'd spent 16 years hoping I'd never have to tell her. Mia had been removed from her birth family due to severe neglect and trauma. She'd spent those first 3 years in conditions so horrible that her mind had blocked out most of the memories to protect itself. I explained that when she came to us, she was malnourished, barely speaking, and had been living in a house with no electricity or running water. Her birth parents had been addicted to drugs and had left her alone for days at a time. Child services had finally intervened when neighbors reported a toddler crying alone in an empty house. The reason I'd lied about her being adopted as a newborn was to protect her from the knowledge that she'd suffered trauma so early in life. The social worker had recommended we create a simpler story to help her build a secure attachment without the burden of knowing about her traumatic beginning. Mia stared at me with tears in her eyes. "So I had a whole life before you, and you just erased it. What if I have siblings out there? What if my birth parents got clean and have been looking for me?" The questions I'd dreaded for 16 years were pouring out of her. I showed her the thick file I'd kept locked away, containing all the documentation from her case. Her birth parents had both died from overdoses within 2 years of losing custody. There were no siblings, no extended family who'd been able to take her. We hadn't erased her past, we'd saved her from it. The hardest part was explaining why her early trauma had affected her memory. The therapist we'd worked with when she was younger had explained that children's minds sometimes block out painful experiences as a survival mechanism. Her lack of early memories wasn't unusual for children who'd experienced severe neglect. Mia spent the next week processing everything, sometimes angry at me for lying, sometimes grateful that I'd protected her from painful truths. She read through her entire case file, looking at photos of the conditions she'd been rescued from, trying to piece together a history she couldn't remember. We started family therapy to work through the impact of my deception and help Mia process her true origin story. The therapist explained that many adoptive parents struggle with how much truth to share and when, especially when the truth involves trauma. 3 months later, Mia decided she wanted to visit the neighborhood where she'd lived before the adoption. We drove through the area together, and she tried to see if anything triggered memories. A few things felt familiar, a playground, a corner store, but mostly it felt like looking at someone else's life. The most healing moment came when Mia thanked me for lying to her for so long. She said knowing she'd been loved and wanted from the moment she could remember was more valuable than knowing about trauma she'd survived. The story of being chosen as a baby had given her security she needed to grow up strong. Now at 17, Mia tells people she was born into my family twice, once biologically and once through adoption. She's proud of being a survivor and uses her story to help other adopted teens understand that complicated beginnings don't define who you become. The birth certificate that started it all now sits in a memory box along with photos from both parts of her life, the difficult beginning she survived and the loving childhood that followed. Sometimes the most loving lies are the ones that give children space to heal before they're strong enough to carry the full truth.